As the election nears, Newsnight is on the road for a conversation in Kissimmee.
We've kind of moved away from the truly purple state of Florida, where we used to be a bellwether for really the country, and we have moved more to a center-right kind of leading state, I think.
We'll discuss the issues, the changes to election laws, and efforts to turn out the vote. Newsnight Conversations starts now. Hello, I'm Steve Maud. Welcome to the first of two special editions of Newsnight Conversations. Over the next 2 weeks, we'll be discussing issues guiding the political conversation leading up to November 5th. Floridians' access to the polls following recent changes to state laws on voting, and the work being done in our region to increase participation in the democratic process. On October 2nd, we held two discussions in front of a live audience at the Bev Event Center in Kissimmee. We'll bring you the first of those conversations in a moment, looking at the growing and diversifying state we live in and how recent changes are shifting the political landscape in Florida. But first, Crystal Knowles looks at efforts by Latino advocacy groups to increase the participation of Hispanic voters this election.
Door-to-door canvassers with the nonpartisan group Poder Latinx pound the pavement in East Orlando to urge residents to vote.
This is a time to speak up, to actually look for that change that you need in your communities. Because at the end of the day, our votes are our voices when it comes to politics, when it comes to pretty much our lifestyle.
In this neighborhood, many people do not speak English, and some are unaware of their voting rights. Despite that, Alejandro Flores, Florida coordinator for Poder Latinx, says the Hispanic vote is powerful enough to create political change.
It is important because the Hispanic community is the sleeping giant in Florida. We have 3.5 million Hispanics who are allowed to vote in the state, who are legally allowed, they're citizens and they're in voting age. However, in the last elections, only 800,000 Hispanics voted out of the 3 million Hispanic. So it is important to awaken that sleeping giant and let them know, hey, you can make a change.
Luis Elena Armas, who was born in Venezuela, says her goal is to knock on at least 200 doors.
Well, I like to communicate with people first. Serving the community is something I've always done and enjoy. I've been working in this for 4 months. Back in my country, I would do this type of work for my community. I like it.
For Flores, canvassing is a way to unite the Latin American community. Also born in Venezuela, he was forced to leave as life became increasingly dangerous. He started gaining attention as an anti-government activist. His story is not uncommon.
For the dictatorship? I even dare to say like 95% of our team comes from Venezuela, so they understand the importance of really getting people engaged, getting people to vote, because look at the state Venezuela is in right now. It was because of apathy. It was because of people not voting and not being vocal about.
Armas says canvassing is far from glamorous and at times can be a little scary.
There are many people who don't trust, and sometimes they might respond in a rude way, but most people are very receptive.
We had a canvasser who a guy pulled up a gun on her. It was shocking, and thankfully she was okay, she's safe. But this is the kind of stuff that they're facing on a daily basis. I wish I could say like, hey, it's gotten better, like everybody's like welcoming them with open arms. That would be a lie. So this is why we're here, to educate and make sure this doesn't continue to happen.
Crystal Knowles reporting on Get Out the Vote efforts in East Orlando. Well, Osceola County is another example of an area that's seen an influx of new residents, especially from Puerto Rico and Venezuela. To discuss how this and other changes have influenced Florida's pivot from being America's largest swing state to a relatively reliable state for Republicans, I was joined by former Republican state senator and founder of the Florida Policy Project, Jeff Brandes, Dick Batchelor, former Democratic state representative and founder of Dick Batchelor Management Group, Florida State Director of the Hispanic Federation, Laudy Campo, and Fernando Rivera, Director of the Puerto Rico Research Hub at UCF.
Well, I think the pandemic had a major impact on Florida. Obviously, as other states shut down, Florida did not. It stayed open in many respects, and I think people decided to move away from high-tax states to states like Florida, and Florida has been kind of reaping the benefits of that and some of the challenges of that. Obviously, housing has gotten more expensive over the last few years. But the state has shifted more red. It's been very interesting. There's about 1 million more registered Republicans now in the state. And so we've kind of moved away from the truly purple state of Florida, where we used to be a bellwether for really the country. And we have moved more to a center-right kind of leading state, I think.
Do you agree with that?
I think it has. If you look at the legislature now, there's a supermajority in the House and Senate. When I was there, Democrats were in control, and it's almost completely reversed now. We get a supermajority, and that entitles the House and Senate, made up of Republicans, to basically pass any legislation they want to pass, kill any legislation they want to kill, fund anything they want to fund, offer constitutional amendments without any help from the Democrats. So obviously it's a very, very strong Republican state of Florida. Notwithstanding some of my disagreements with the governor certainly has put Florida on the map in a big way, not only running for president, but also in his leadership. I would say parenthetically though, some Democrats have been able to get some things done, some things passed, reach across the aisle, but if the Republicans don't want to do that, they can slap your hand and say, we're going to do it our way.
And of course, Florida's had a Republican legislature for much longer than the last few years or so. That's not a new phenomenon. Jeff mentioned there the sort of migration into the state from within the mainland, but I wonder, Fernando, how much of a difference you think arrivals from Puerto Rico have made. Do you see a change in their political leanings, and is that going to affect the political map, do you think, in places like where we are right now in Osceola County?
Well, I think so, and definitely, we had migrations of Puerto Ricans, right? And I think one of the key issues that we're finding is economic issues, right? So you get the, people that come from Puerto Rico for economic opportunities, but you had people from New York and Pennsylvania and other areas that happen to be Puerto Rican that are moving to the region as well. So that's that interesting movement of people are sort of testament to what we're seeing right now in terms of those economic opportunities, and that's been kind of like the trademark for a lot of the Puerto Rican population movement in the past, right? Seeking economic opportunities. Obviously, that movement of a lot of people is bringing a lot of challenges, like Jeff was saying, here to the state. So how long is that going to make an impact that we're going to see? Because, if we look at sort of the population movement of Puerto Ricans out here, it sort of resembles what happened in the 1940s and 50s in the northeastern state out there. And we see kind of like there's been a shift in that population here. And Florida has the state with the most Puerto Ricans of all the states out here. So definitely growing, the numbers are changing. But as long as there are economic opportunities, people are going to come here and they're going to have an impact in the community.
Unlike migrants from other countries, people from Puerto Rico are US citizens, right? And they vote, they can vote in elections. Do you get a feeling what the priorities are for Puerto Rican voters in Central Florida? They make up such a large slice of the electorate, particularly in places like Osceola County. What is motivating those voters? I'll come to you first, and then I'll ask Laudy.
Well, we just did a Puerto Ricans in Florida survey, and what we found was the big issues were education, the economy, and cost of living. And I think that some of the work that other groups have done out there find the same thing. So a lot of pocketbook issues are the ones that are driving out here.
So maybe not so different to the electorate at large. What do you think, Laudy?
I agree with that. Recently, we did a poll, and that was the 60% of the answers, economic. It was pocketbook, like you mentioned, issues like affordable housing, it was the inflation, it was job creation. But other things that we're concerned about, and I'm talking about the Latino community, which we Puerto Ricans are part of it, it was also immigration, it was also gun control, and it was also abortion.
Well, what about the Hispanic community writ large, I guess? I mean, we've seen a surge in Venezuelans, for example, in Central and South Florida over the last few years amid the security crisis there. What are the issues that you detect amongst newer arrivals, I guess those that are now US citizens that can vote? I mean, do you see parallels to what we saw for many years in the Cuban American population? Do they view themselves as exiles? Do they vote on that issue?
When you think about the Latino community that are coming here, they're very focused in economic. They're leaving their countries for many reasons, and also they are very concerned about that. But also they're very focused because they understand the power that they bring to the state. So yes, for them it's very important the immigrant community, the immigration, but as much as important is the economic. Again, they understand what they bring, and they understand the power that brings to the state as well. And that's what we have seen in Impulse that we have done.
I do want to drill down a little bit on something that you mentioned earlier, Jeff, and that was COVID. Of course, many of us, that's in the rearview mirror. But the impact of COVID-19, I think, has changed the political landscape, and you talked a little bit about that. I wonder if you could sort of expound on that. And does that still resonate, do you think, with voters even now? Do you think that will be making a difference in this election?
Well, look, 750 people move to Florida net every single day. And so I think that highlights it. But let's just take one data point of housing, because housing is clearly top of mind. Back during kind of the COVID era of just 2019, 2020, you could buy a house in Central Florida for about $250,000. Today, that's $400,000, right? And so what we're seeing is that demand has well outstripped supply of housing. And that is one thing that I think is going to hold Florida back going forward. We have to address these issues like housing, property insurance, general affordability. These are the top 3 issues in the state of Florida. A poll was just released today by the Associated Industries of Florida, and really tying neck and neck in the state was general affordability, kind of everything's costing more, and property insurance at 23%. Both they said that was the number 1 issue in Florida. The number 3 issue in Florida was housing at 12%, who's saying that housing was becoming the most challenging issue. So I think, we can see all of these things beginning to play out, but I think what's going to slow the migration to Florida is frankly that just housing is costing so much more, property insurance is costing so much more, and this general affordability issues. Florida isn't the super affordable state it was just a handful of years ago.
I can certainly attest to that. The legislature, of course, passed the Live Local Act. You were one of the leaders on pushing for homeowners insurance reform. Is the legislature, do you think, doing enough to tackle all these things?
No, look, here's the thing. We have these great public universities. We have some students from UCF in the audience with us today. What university is doing any research on housing or doing any research on property insurance? None of them. The legislature, to my knowledge, has 0 research studies. We had OPAGA. We have no research studies going on in the state on the issue of housing of housing affordability or on the issue of insurance. There's a lot more we should be doing. We should be the nation's leader in best practices on both of those issues, instead of what we're currently doing, which is just kind of a big question mark.
What do you think, Dick? What are the issues that you see motivating voters this time around?
Speak to housing for a moment, because it's a very key issue, as the senator pointed out. And in Central Florida, it's really exacerbated by the fact that low-income jobs here in the tourism industry. And you have people having to pay 50% of their gross income for rent, and that's not sustainable. And so unfortunately, Orange County has an affordable housing task force. They've made recommendations, they put up some money, but it's a Band-Aid. And I know I'm not being critical of the county, but it's a Band-Aid when it comes to affordable housing. And getting me back to Jeff's comment about insurance too, when you're alluding to the storm, you can't get property insurance. If you do, it's a 40 to 50% increase in your premium costs. And now with this hurricane damage, you're going to find a lot of people who are not insured. They didn't carry the flood insurance. They didn't think they needed it. And now they have no insurance because their traditional insurance doesn't cover floods or acts of God, if we might call them those. So it's difficult. So owning a house, building a house, owning a house is one thing, but also the requirements that come with it, like you've got to have insurance. If you have a mortgage, you've got to have insurance. So it's very, very difficult. So I agree, housing is a really, really critical issue in this state and throughout this state.
When Dick mentioned the affordability issue, I heard you agree with that. What do you think?
Our communities are one of the most vulnerable. They are the least paid. They're the ones who were first responders during COVID, but yet they're the ones who are getting less recuperation in the economy. And plus, we cannot think about affordable housing without thinking of climate change. This is a state where it gets affected. Like we had a storm last week and we're looking into another thing. So these are things that we need to take into consideration because it all affects economy. So yes, I totally agree.
What do you think? Do you think underserved communities are particularly vulnerable at this time because of that affordability issue? Do you see that as a big issue this election?
Yeah, absolutely. And we did sort of a study looking at what was the impact of the people that came after Hurricane Maria here. And we found that the community was able to absorb it. There was no issues with housing or job market or anything like that. But that was 2018. Now we look at it, and only in 5 years these have changed. 5-6 years have changed dramatically in terms of that. And I was recently looking at the numbers, in terms of the Puerto Rican population, and it's dipped slowly from 2022 to 23. So we're seeing again that, how long can the state of Florida attract people when we have low wages, especially here in the Central Florida area that seem to be kind of like the entry jobs for a lot of the Latino and immigrant groups out here. How long are you able to, provide this? Because right now it's becoming unsustainable, and eventually we'll have, people will seek opportunities where they are, and we're seeing kind of like some of that interesting movement as well. Where you see growing of at least of the Puerto Rican population in places like Massachusetts, North Carolina, even Texas, of other states out here. So it's And again, the example is Puerto Ricans, but when people are looking for economic opportunities, they follow the same trends as the general public.
I mean, are the issues in Florida sort of emblematic, do we think, of what we're seeing nationwide? Obviously, in terms of insurance, and that's a very Florida-specific issue. The affordability issue isn't, but I do wonder whether, you think our state has some unique challenges. Laudy mentioned, for example, the issue of resiliency. What do you think, Jeff?
Well, I think a lot of states are struggling with insurance. California has its struggles. Texas has its struggles. Florida has its struggles in the insurance side, and same on housing, right? We have to, there are best practices that are out there. That's why I created a nonprofit to focus on that. But there are best practices that are out there. But I think there are some uniquely Florida challenges. I think property insurance definitely is a uniquely Florida challenge. I think the growth of the state like Florida, it doesn't just affect housing, it's transportation, it's healthcare services, it's law enforcement. Growth at the levels that we've seen is straining all across the Florida, the system. And not to mention even our prison system, which will, by the end of the decade, have well over 100,000 inmates in it. And so we're strained at every level. And I think this is where the unique challenge, yes, Florida does have a supermajority of Republicans in the legislature, but it also means they have the responsibility to lead on all these different issues. And I would argue on many of these issues, there isn't a lot of leadership, and we're falling behind.
I want to just pivot and talk a little bit about the raw politics. In terms of what our legislators and congressional candidates are running on in our state this election, we've seen in previous cycles a lot of the culture issues. Do we still think that is important to people? I guess, is the governor still driving the agenda in the state? What do you think candidates are running on? What do they identify as important? What do you think, Jeff?
I think Governor DeSantis has kind of had three phases of his governorship. I think he had the honeymoon phase the first couple of years when legislatures kind of just getting to know him. I think then he's had his presidential phase, and kind of now we're in the sunset or question mark phase. And it'll be interesting to see how he handles the last couple of years, as the transition to new leadership comes in. I think this is what people will remember about Governor DeSantis, is really his last couple of years. And so I think that's the challenge for him, is to show real leadership in some of these areas that Florida's really struggling with.
Is there a route for Democrats in this state?
There's a route, but I'm not sure it's that feasible politically. I would say Florida's not in play on the presidential race, but to the extent there's a head fake in Florida, if the Democratic U.S. Senate candidate gets money from the DSCC, she can put Florida in play. When I say it's a head fake, what happens in a campaign is if you can force Florida, the Trump campaign and the DeSantis people, to be forced them to have to spend money in Florida where they should not have to spend any money. But there are two issues I think. It can be a modicum of influence, and you only need to swing on 1 or 2 points. I think the abortion issue, which is on the ballot, as we know,
Amendment
can
4.
turn out, and then the recreational marijuana issue, I think will turn out young people who traditionally vote Democratic. So I think the answer is yes, there are two cultural issues, one of the choice issue and one of the recreational marijuana. I think could turn out some people, and not put Florida in play, but put them in play enough to force the incumbents to have to spend money to survive.
Democrats have sort of counted on those issues to do that for them in other states. It hasn't necessarily panned out, though.
Well, it has in a number of states. In Ohio, it panned out. It's all on the ballot in Arizona, which is a very important must-win state. So those issues, the social issues, are on the ballot. Now, keep in mind, though, in Florida, because the legislature used to be 50% plus one to pass the constitutional amendment, now it's 60%. So it's a very, very high bar to set. So it'll be very interesting to see if you could sustain the interest in those two issues up to and through the election day.
How about the communities that you talk to on a regular basis? I mean, one of the things that really interests me is the shift politically in a number of those communities. Do you think that as that population diversifies, so do their politics?
Well, I think that there's always a possibility with the Latino community, as long as you come to our community and to talk to us. I think that's the most important thing. And when we think about nationally, we did a poll, and again, we mentioned about things that are mentioned here in Florida, for example, abortion. And it's very important to our communities. So for candidates, more than anything, and the shift to any way, they have to come to our communities, not at the last minute. And that is one of the key issues that the candidates of any party affiliation have to take into consideration. Another thing is like with the change in the ticket as a presidential ticket, they showed that 75% of Latinos in the United States are willing to vote more than anyone, like now. And the target, the groups are 18 plus, women and Hispanic speaking people. These are 15% nationally of voters, and in Florida they represent 22%. Take care, like use this information and make sure to come to our communities.
Well, let's actually start with this one, and this is something I think that you talked about before, and this is the challenges of Florida's increasing population. How do you influence those universities that you talked about, higher education institutions, to research the housing crisis?
Well, it's a great question. The state of Florida gives these institutions billions of dollars every single year to build new buildings and fund students. I would argue that we should create centers of excellence at the universities that they can lose, right? There has to be this incentive that you can lose this opportunity. For example, Florida has this Schimberg Center at the University of Florida that produces data, but actually doesn't produce best practices to help guide policymakers. I don't know about when you were in the office, but in my 12 years in the legislature, 0 times did a university come to me with a solution to a Florida problem. I think, unfortunately, what's happened is actually we disincentivize the universities from getting engaged, right? In carpentry, they say that the tall nail gets hammered, right? The nail that sticks out gets hammered. And I think universities have gotten to a place where they just realize, hey, listen, the legislature's going to fund me. So if I make a recommendation and they don't like it, maybe they'll come at me. And I think that's a problem. I think we've actually disincentivized the universities from engaging in the political discourse with some of the things the legislature has done over the last few years, and I think we have to change that model.
Well, we have somebody from the university right here. What do you think?
There's people like me trying to engage out here in terms of that, but it's become a tall order. You know, we cannot be blind to the realities that, you know, we have a very, you know, disintellectual sort of push out there in terms of that. You know, we're questioning the value of going to college. We're questioning, you know, should students go out there and all sorts of things. And it's a shame, right? Because I think every public state university is the best asset that they have, and they should utilize it. I think not only the Florida legislature, but over the nation, that should be your first asset out there, because you're using that money out there in terms of that. So sometimes I feel like instead of this cultural war battles that we have, hey, let's come together, you know, talk to me. And I think these conversations are very healthy. And that's what I've tried to do as much as I can. Go to Tallahassee, and we have participated in Tallahassee. I've gone to Congress. I'm trying to do my best to make sure that whatever I learn, I make sure that the decision makers actually know that information and coming up with solutions, and hopefully they can implement some of those.
I want to wrap up with this question. How important is the issue of a woman's right to choose in this election? Let me start with you, Laudy, on this. And when you talk to voters around the state, do you get a feeling that the abortion issue is an issue that motivates voters, that is important to them?
I mean, when we did the survey, 18% of the Latino community say that it's important that. And it's interesting how you speak to a Latino when you speak about women's rights and abortion. Is a very different way and different approaches. You ask the same question. So those are the things that we need to make in consideration. And of course, in this state, it's different. Abortion, it's been one of the top in many places, and it's mentioned in churches, and it's okay because we come from a base of Christian and things like that. But when you talk to a woman, to a Latinx person, and you talk differently, you could get different answers. And another thing I want to point out is that, again, young women, and when you speak with women and young people, you'll get a different feedback as well.
The first of our discussions held recently in Kissimmee. Next week, our Newsnight conversation will look at changes to Florida's election laws in recent years and more on the issues driving voters' choices. Meanwhile, WCF has teamed up with our public media partners around the state to create a voter guide to help you navigate the candidates and where they stand on the issues this election. Be sure to check out this important resource at wcf.org/vote. But that is all the time we have for this week. We'll see you here again next Friday night at 8:30 on WCF. In the meantime, from all of us here at Newsnight, take care and have a great week.